in sho mostore moyana mohyoit kankali moquid gun tilwar.
Hey there, I'm author Sarah A. Chrisman.
And I'm Gabriel Chrisman.
And today we're talking about The Graves Are Walking by John Kelly. Mm-hmm. This is...
It's a bit of a downer.
Well, it's about the Irish famine.
Yes.
So this is a book that honestly, I think, because the Irish people had such an influence on American history, I think it's a book that every American should read.
Especially everyone interested in Victorian history.
And especially everyone who's interested in Irish history as well. And the history of the Irish in America, because this is the story of how so many Irish wound up coming to America.
Right.
And I think that the story of the Irish famine is one that all Americans really need to know, because it's part of Irish history, but it's part of our history too, because it led to so many immigrants coming to America. So he manages to condense all the information very tightly. This is a very dense book. The famine years were basically 1845 to 1847, and that's when the population of Ireland shrank by about a third, which is pretty incredible.
Between the deaths from the famine and then the
emigration.
Yep.
Yeah. And it started with a potato blight. So the Irish, their main form of starch was the potato.
Because it could be grown in very small plots and produced a really dense crop.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then there was a fungus that attacked the potato and basically made them inedible. It killed the plants and turned the tubers into just slime, basically black slime. That if you tried to eat it, you got really, really sick. Mm-hmm. And so without the potatoes, when the potato crop failed, because so many Irish, they were already kind of on the brink of starvation.
And then there was this monoculture of potatoes,
right,
that just had no ecological stability.
Right.
One thing was enough to wipe out pretty much the food supply for all of the poor in Ireland.
Right, which is why I get worried when I look around the America's agriculture and see so many monocultures here now, because reading about the famine, you get kind of scared of monocultures because you realize how fragile they are, and how vulnerable they are to anything going wrong. And so when the Irish didn't have their potatoes, they didn't have much to fall back on because they had been relying so heavily on potatoes for their carbohydrates. And they had been subsisting on a very, very low protein, very low meat diet. They had a little bit of milk, a little bit of meat, but not very much of either one.
And the wealthier farmers that produced grain of any sort almost exclusively exported that grain.
That went straight to England.
Yep.
Yeah. And it kept going to England even after the potatoes failed. And that's one of the really dark things about the story of the Irish famine, is that even while the Irish were starving in huge, huge numbers, it got to the point where even the wild crows were dying of hunger, and that is saying something.
That is saying that there was no food in the landscape.
There was no food in the landscape.
Right.
Even through this, the upper crust in Ireland are still exporting grain to England. Now, the upper crust in Ireland at this point, it gets really complicated, and he goes into this, because a few hundred years earlier, when Cromwell had come over to Ireland, about the time of the English Civil War, Cromwell had just devastated Ireland, and he wound up putting in a ruling class of Protestant English.
Yeah.
So these are hardcore.
Right. Well, Cromwell was as hardcore as it gets. He was the ultimate Puritan Protestant, and he had exactly the impression that you might imagine of the Catholic Irish.
Right. And so These are hardcore Protestant English that are set in place, in command over, in control over all of the Catholic Irish peasantry. Now,
Who didn't even speak their same language.
They didn't even speak their same language. The Irish spoke Gaelic,
Mm-hmm.
which is a Celtic language. It's not even in the same language family. English is a Germanic language. We have more, the English language has more in common with German than with most other languages. The Irish language was Gaelic. It was related to Breton, Welsh, and Manx from the Isle of Man.
Mm-hmm.
So totally different language and totally different customs, totally different culture. And
totally different version of Christianity in general. I mean, even compared to the other Catholics, the Irish Catholics were still kind of their own thing.
Right, absolutely. And so the legacy of Cromwell's people who are ruling over the Irish peasantry, they have no common ground with these people. They don't feel that these are their people. They don't feel any obligation to these people.
Not even slightly.
Not even slightly.
These weren't even sort of like fellow English serfs, as
No.
it would have been in England.
Right.
This is an entirely alien culture
Right.
that they looked down on in every way.
They looked at them as a resource to extract.
Mm-hmm.
They looked down at the Irish They looked at the Irish landscape and saw a resource to extract, and the Irish peasantry was their means of extracting that resource.
Yeah.
And so when the Irish peasantry started dying, their landlords kept selling all the grain to England. And when it became cheaper to evict their tenants than to pay the various taxes associated with having tenants, they evicted them.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, when they saw that the cost of beef over in England was rising, they said, oh, well, I could make more profit off of that land by grazing cattle there than by having these, Irish tenants who are, they're starving anyways, so they would kick them out too.
Yeah.
And so you had just this terrible, terrible situation. And what else was going on as the Irish people were dying and the word of this was going over to England, because at this point Ireland is an English colony at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the mid
One of many.
One of many, but it was the first. It was the first.
And it was the
English
closest.
colony.
I mean,
Yeah.
unless you count Wales, which...
Or Scotland.
Yeah.
But Ireland is a separate island,
Yeah.
so it's generally considered the first English colony.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, so they are appealing to England, saying that our people are starving over in Ireland. Now, the man in the English Treasury who is in charge of any aid that might have gone to Ireland at this point is Trevelyan. I first encountered Trevelyan's name in an Irish folk song, Low Lie the Fields of Athenry, which is this gut-wrenching song, if any of you have ever heard it.
Like many Irish folk songs.
It will make you just sob. It is the saddest song. It is the song of this man who is sentenced to be hung the next morning, and he's saying goodbye to his wife. And the reason he has been sentenced to hang is, for I stole Trevelyan's corn that the young might see the morn.
Yes, right.
And
so this is the corn that was being exported to England.
well, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yeah. And then Trevelyan also, he was a firm believer in Adam Smith's philosophy of economics, that the government should not interfere with economics at all.
And of course, the whole idea of the wealth of nations was to extract everything you could from the colonies and build up the wealth of your empire.
Right, right. And Trevelyan also, as a very staunch Protestant, believed that God had sent the famine to punish Catholic Ireland, and that to interfere with that would be blasphemy. This is not the guy you want in charge of aid during a famine. This is like the last guy you want in charge of aid during a famine. But he was. And one of the things that wound up happening is that the English government said, okay, well, American maize, and here we get into the really complicated
Right.
linguistics. Corn,
As a general term in England, meant any sort of grain.
right. In America, corn has a very specific meaning.
Right.
And so I'm going to try to stick with calling, for this particular discussion,
Right.
I'm going to try to stick with calling it maize because that's a little less ambiguous.
Right.
But it's what we grow everywhere here in
Right.
Iowa. I mean, you look out your window in the summer and you see it.
But that's what they wanted to use as sort of famine relief, is
Right.
this cheap American maize.
Right.
Now, we're talking not sweet corn here, we're
No.
talking...
This is feed corn. This is corn that's usually used for feeding hogs.
Right.
And to make
It's
it,
dry, it's hard.
it's very hard.
Right.
It's very hard. And that was one of the problems because the mills that they had in Ireland for grinding grain were set up to grind wheat.
And possibly oats. Or,
And possibly oats or barley, a little bit of
yeah.
rye, but small quantities of all of these. Maize is very, very hard, and actually at the Harvest Festival last fall, we watched maize being ground.
And it's a larger kernel, too.
It's a larger kernel. If you're anywhere in the Midwest, you are absolutely familiar with what I'm talking about.
Yes, right.
For folks anywhere else outside the Midwest, the closest thing you've probably encountered is popcorn. So think of something approximately the texture of popcorn.
But larger and flatter.
Larger and flatter.
Yeah.
And it's mostly, again, used to feed livestock. It's mostly used to feed hogs. You can grind it, the first grind, it comes out at a texture that you feed to hogs. Even hogs can't eat it straight off the cob. You have to grind it at least once for hogs. If you re-grind it a second time, then it's the size you feed to chickens. To make it palatable and digestible to humans, you have to grind it 3 times. And that's 3 times with steel grinding equipment. The
Not
Irish,
stone. Right.
Not stone. The Irish just had stone. And so this was a huge, huge problem because at first the thought that went on in the British mind was, well, maize is cheaper than these other grains that Ireland is producing. We still want those other grains for England, so we're going to keep exporting the wheat and the rye to England, and we'll just ship them some Yankee maize to get them by. Now, in the first place, maize is much lower nutrition value than these other grains.
And they didn't know how to grind it.
And they didn't know how to
And they
grind it.
didn't have the equipment to grind it properly
Right.
to make it digestible.
Right.
And they were starving.
And they were starving.
So, of course, they tried to just boil it and eat it.
Right, which doesn't work very well, and it leads to massive intestinal issues. And at first people were calling it Trevelyan's brimstone because it was causing such bad problems with people trying to digest this. And it's not something you want to especially feed to someone who's already starving because it's just, you can't digest it. Anyhow, so that was one thing that went on. And the British government is just kind of slowly trickling this Yankee maize into the Irish market to try to keep the local sellers from just spiking everything up to famine prices. And they're not doing that on a consistent basis. It's just tiny little bits here and there, and Trevelyan would occasionally just decide, oh, no more, that's enough for now. And then you get another massive round of dying.
Or immigration, which is the other thing going on at this time, of course.
Right.
Because if everyone saw what was happening in Ireland, if they had any possibility of getting out.
And the first to leave were the middle classes,
Yep.
because they were the ones who saw what was coming and they were able to pull up stakes and leave. Wasn't easy. They weren't happy about it. This was their home, but they could do it. And then it wasn't until later on in the really harshest depths of the famine that the peasant class started just selling literally the clothes off their backs to get passage anywhere but here.
Anywhere, yep.
Yeah. And a lot
Wherever
of
it was cheapest.
And a lot of those clothes wound up getting pulped for rags to make paper over in England. And so they would be, on the decks of these ships in the winter with nothing but maybe a blanket that someone from the ship had given them because they were embarrassed. And then around 1847, you also get some of the landlord classes emigrating because they were darn scared. Yeah. Because by that point, the people had suffered so many deaths, so much tragedy. They were actively rebelling.
Right.
And it was just anarchy, basically.
Mm-hmm. And it was impossible for the British to protect the landlord class at that point from these huge mobs.
Well, the English didn't really care about the landlord class any more than they cared about the Irish peasants.
No.
Yeah, the English, even though the landlord class had originally come from England...
It had been a couple hundred years.
It had been a couple hundred years, and the English by this point sort of looked at them as like the crazy second cousins.
Right.
They didn't really understand them. They didn't have much in common with them anymore.
And some of these people actually were Oscar Wilde's parents.
Yeah, actually. And that's really interesting because this author does talk about, especially Oscar Wilde's mother, because she left some records of what was going on, because she was that landed class in Ireland, the upper class. And so that's some of her stuff in here is very interesting. And one of the bits that just was like a stab to the heart was in early 1847. The situation in Ireland was so bad, and there were so many people starving, that even though England still wasn't really doing anything to speak of to help Ireland, the word had gotten out around the globe. And so you finally start getting international contributions coming in.
Right.
And the really just tear-jerking one that is just so gut-wrenching is they got $170 donated from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Now, if you know anything about American history and the history of American Indians, the Choctaw Nation are...
They were not doing well at this point.
They are not doing well in the 1840s.
No. They have been chased, from reservation to reservation until they finally ended up in Oklahoma on some land which no one else wanted at the time. Right.
But they were so moved by the Irish plight that they managed, in their own dire poverty, they managed to scrape up $170 to send to starving Ireland.
Right, exactly.
Which is just... that's gut-wrenching.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the other ones that, that were just gut-wrenching in here was the relief officer. And his experience, he ended up seeing what was going on, writing a report.
Yeah, he wrote a report. Let me find that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's, so this is an English officer. So... After inspecting the South Dublin workhouse, Mr. Barden, a municipal relief official, declared the facility a, quote, haunt of desperate suffering and a disgrace to a civilized country. Then he went home and shot himself.
Yeah. So the people who were seeing what was actually going on, people were hearing about this, and it was horrifying.
It was horrifying.
Yeah.
It was horrifying. And it's not like the government was giving away this Yankee maize that they were sending to Ireland. People still had to buy it, and the only jobs were breaking rock to make roads. And the roads didn't go anywhere because they didn't have any engineers, but they refused to give food to these starving people because that would be, against principles, I guess?
Against the Protestant work ethic.
Right. And so they still had to buy it.
And against the economic principles.
Right. So they still had to buy it, and so they had to be breaking rocks to buy this unground, in many cases, Yankee maize.
Right,
yeah.
that they couldn't eat and that they couldn't process to make it edible.
Right. And so...
Just a nightmare.
Yeah. And there was a saying that the Irish had at the time that then got sort of codified when one of the chroniclers of the famine wrote it down, which is that God sent the blight, but England sent the famine. Mm-hmm. Because the what people saw going on was that there was a natural disaster that had happened that nobody could have predicted.
And this is what happens for most famines in the modern world too.
Right.
Which is that there's something, a drought or a crop failure or, you know, some crop disease, or in this case like a fungus, but that in itself isn't sufficient to cause a famine.
Right, right.
What causes the famine is the government's not reacting properly to this in a variety of ways.
Right, and we see that with a lot of disasters, honestly. Mm-hmm. There is some natural misfortune that happens. Something bad happens that no one could have predicted, no one could have controlled. Something bad happens, and then humans just mess it up.
They make it endlessly worse.
Make it endlessly worse. They take something that would have been sad, that would have been unfortunate, and they turn it into an absolute catastrophe.
An epic disaster.
An epic disaster.
And this epic disaster is the reason why you see so many Irish in America.
Right, exactly.
And honestly, in other countries like Canada as well.
Right.
Because there was nothing left for them in Ireland. And
right.
They had to get out.
Right.
And so that is why you saw such huge immigration. And that's why it's a really important piece of history for everyone to know about it.
Absolutely. It helps you understand why there are so many of Irish descent in America, and it also helps you understand, it gives you perspective on a lot of things. There, I can think of at least one circumstance in that we've seen in our life where something bad happened and the government made it, the people in general made it far worse. But I won't get into that because that's for another day. But anyhow, very important book, and
this is one of the best tellings of this history that we've found. Yeah,
definitely. So I highly recommend it. The Graves You're Walking by John Kelly.
It may be a painful read, but it's an important one.
It's a painful read, but an important one, and you might not want to read it all at one sitting because it is just so gut-wrenching. It's hard to take at one sitting. But if you need to take a break from it,
we would understand.
You have my permission. Read some of it, take a break, read some more, finish it in your own time. But I think it's an important book for everyone to read. So there we go. So thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to give it a nice thumbs up. And if you need something cheerful after reading this, remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!
She doth more, she doth more, she doth more, she calica nergid. She doth more, while Irish warrior skirt, she goes to wash a gashergid.